I don't typically review games I play. Usually I just throw the footage out there. But this game doesn't have any video reviews. The single video review that's on YouTube has a glaring inaccuracy. The person who uploaded the review said that the game was 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I don't know how you could have possibly made that mistake when the box and the manual, the primer guide if you own it, they all remark upon this being the very first 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons computer game. And obviously when it was released there was all kinds of marketing and people talking about how this is the first 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons computer game, so it kind of makes you wonder how much attention this guy actually paid to the game as he was playing it. Or perhaps he's just completely ignorant of Dungeons & Dragons. Either way, it doesn't inspire a whole lot of confidence in his review. But his review's irrelevant, really. After having completed the game, I must say I'm very shocked at all the negative press this game got when it was released. Now, a lot of it was directed towards all the bugs the game had. I can't say that my playthrough was full of bugs. I only encountered one major bug, and that was over halfway through the game. The game can crash a bit, but that really only happens if you load saves a bunch of times back to back. If you space out your reloads, or if you just let your party die and then it goes to the death cutscene and then you reload, it won't crash. That's the only major bug, aside from the one I'll discuss a bit later in this review, that I encountered in the game, other than occasional audio and some visual bugs, which you'll encounter in any game. Of course, I'm playing the most up-to-date version of the game. I forget which version it is, but it's from 2002. The very latest patch, and it runs perfectly fine. Even on modern versions of Windows, it should run perfectly fine. From a game design perspective, it's quite an enjoyable game in my opinion. It can be a bit slow-paced, and it is just a dungeon crawl. I mean, all you're really going to be doing the entire game is combat, so if that's not your cup of tea, you don't pick it up. But if you want just a straight 3rd edition dungeon crawl, it's a pretty incredible game. My main gripe with it from a design perspective is that you can't select which feats you want. I think you select a feat every 4 levels in 3rd edition, or maybe it's every 3. But in any event, you can't select your feats. They're just assigned to you automatically based upon which class you've selected during level up. It kind of sucks, but it's not really a huge deal to me, because practically all the feats that are in the game are valuable. Obviously, some feats are more valuable than others, and it's unfortunate that different classes allot different feats in different orders, but that's just the way it is, and again, it's unfortunate, but to me it wasn't a huge deal. It may upset some people. Personally, I didn't care a whole lot, especially since the 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons computer games obviously didn't have that system at all, because it simply didn't exist in 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons tabletop. And another problem that was noted when this game was released is that the combat can take quite a while to play out, even against really weak opponents that you can kill in 2 or 3 turns. And that's because the movement speed of some of these enemies is very slow, especially the undead enemies. So it can take a full minute for all these undead enemies to move, only for you to take 2 turns to kill them. So essentially the vast majority of the time is just spent in these enemies moving around. Fortunately, that doesn't happen too often. It happens more than I care for, but it doesn't happen as often as some of the older magazine reviews might have you believe. The vast majority of the enemies in the game are undead, but usually you'll only encounter them in groups of 4 or 5. And they're in cramped environments, so they're not coming at you from 200 foot away. Usually their turns will be over in, 5 or 10 seconds max. One thing I really love about this game is the map system. You actually have to take notes on the map. You have to place these little flags on the map, and then you can write whatever you want on them. And you can place as many of these flags as you like. You could put 100 on them on one map screen if you wanted to. In one map area, one map cell. So if you find something, but like a locked chest, and you can't open it right now, you can put a note there, and you can check the map later, and you can find out where it is, and come back to it, and unlock it when you're able to do so. A lot of people would probably prefer that this be an automated process, but I kind of like having this be a manual process. It teaches you to pay more attention to what's going on in the game. being forced to take notes in the game forces you to be more mentally aware. It's kind of nice. And it's not something you're going to encounter in too many games. The map in Pool of Radiance, Ruins of Myth Drannor is very basic. And if you're not taking notes, you're absolutely going to miss out on all kinds of things. You're going to walk right past things you want to come back to, and then you're not going to be able to find them again. So taking notes is very important, and it's a cool feature. I want to speak briefly about the size of the game world and how common enemies are, and also a bit about the difficulty. But the map is a bit too expansive for my liking. There's a lot of backtracking because of the size of the map. There are too many weak enemies in the game for how quickly you level. The game really becomes kind of a joke in terms of difficulty, for the most part. If they get a surprise round on you, you can lose pretty quickly, but the majority of the time, if the enemy doesn't get a surprise round on you, you're going to mop the floor with them, if you've got a well-designed party anyway. So the game overall isn't too difficult, and most of the encounters, like I said, they become a joke pretty quickly, unfortunately. The game does have a few moments of extreme difficulty, and those are pretty fun. The early parts of the game and the final couple dungeons are the most difficult parts of the entire experience. The final boss fight is actually extremely difficult, compared to most of the game anyway. I mean, there are definitely boss fights in other games that are far more difficult than the final boss in this game, but compared to the vast majority of this game. But the game just has too much backtracking, there are too many mobs of weak enemies, and you become too powerful too quickly. Those are three of the biggest design issues, in my opinion. They also give you a lot of really powerful equipment pretty quickly also. That's another one. That's a big issue, but whatever. That happens in practically every Dungeons & Dragons computer game. They all hand you powerful equipment very quickly. It's kind of par for the course for Dungeons & Dragons games. But I really did enjoy this game quite a bit. I'm pretty shocked it's got so many negative reviews. Of course, not video reviews, but magazine reviews, when it came out. It's quite fun, in spite of the flaws I've discussed. I mean, the game's got an amazing soundtrack. The combat is fun, even if it is a bit repetitive and not very difficult. It looks great, at least in my opinion. That's completely subjective, of course. And the presentation was really good as well. The in-game cutscenes were great, and the few dozen very difficult fights in the game really make it worth playing it. Really, the game is worth playing for the beautiful visuals, the great soundtrack, the handful of very difficult fights sprinkled throughout, the amazing cutscenes, and the final boss battle, which is very good. But if you can't tolerate the dozens of not very difficult fights, that's understandable. But I don't know what people were expecting when this game came out. As far as I know, it was marketed as a dungeon crawler. I don't know why people expected anything other than a dungeon crawler. A dungeon crawler, by its very nature, is going to be repetitive, and at some point it's going to become pretty easy. It's just that this one becomes pretty easy early on. But in spite of all of its faults, I would say that this is my favorite Dungeons & Dragons computer game. It's right up there with Temple of Elemental Evil for me, just because the soundtrack is great, cutscenes are great. I love exploring the ruins, even though they are pretty expansive, and it does get kind of tiresome after a while. Exploring all these areas for the first time is really incredible. It's just a really unique and interesting game because of its presentation. So I would highly recommend this game to anyone who likes dungeon crawlers, especially, or anyone who just likes turn-based tactical combat games. But there is one serious bug to watch out for if you are going to play this game, and that is do not save near dramatic visual effects. They will completely corrupt your save. Doing this almost ended my playthrough. Luckily I had a save from like 5 minutes before that allowed me to continue my playthrough instead of it being completely gone. The only area where I know this is a problem for certain is in the catacombs prisons near some giant green effect. The same effect is used again in the Pool of Radiance at the very end of the game, so don't save near it there either. It's just giant like splash of green across the screen. Yeah, don't save near that. It will corrupt your save. I'm sure there are a few other things too, but I don't know. It's just better to be safe than sorry. Don't save near any dramatic visual effect of any kind. When you're going to save, go to a bland area where absolutely nothing is going on. Now, basic things like, a flame effect or the effects from spells and things like that, those will not corrupt your save, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you see some giant visual effect that's splashing all across the screen, don't save near it. It might corrupt your save. But with that out of the way, again, I would highly recommend this game, especially to people who like dungeon crawlers and tactical combat games. One big thing a lot of people are going to be wondering about is choice and consequence in Pool of Radiance, Ruins of Myth Drannor. Does the game have multiple endings? Are there side quests in which I can do something other than what I was told to do? No, there are not. The game is very linear, but it's something that didn't even really occur to me to cover in this review. I added this in later. And that's because there are so many other role-playing games which are really completely linear. Baldur's Gate 1, Baldur's Gate 2, the Echelon games, all of the Elder Scrolls games, Fallout 3, Fallout 4, Siege of Avalon, and so on. There are a great deal of very linear role-playing games, but most of those allow you quite a bit of freedom in the side quests. But Pool of Radiance, Ruins of Myth Drannor doesn't really have many side quests. There are all kinds of things to do, and there are quite a few NPCs to talk to, but there are only a few neutral NPCs that, depending upon what you say to them, may or may not become hostile. That's really about the extent of player choice in this game. And it didn't even really occur to me to cover that, as I said, because I wasn't even really thinking of this as a role-playing game, which, is it? Really, it's just a dungeon crawler with, the traditional role-playing Dungeons & Dragons rule set. Dungeons & Dragons, of course, being the original role-playing system. So, is it a role-playing game because it uses the Dungeons & Dragons rule set? Or is it not a role-playing game because it lacks choice and consequence? It's up to you to determine that. Really, it's a pointless categorization. I just look at it as a good game. As a final thought, I wanted to share what I think could have been done to improve the game dramatically, and I think this could have elevated the game to the same status as classic Dungeons & Dragons computer games, the most highly revered Dungeons & Dragons computer games, such as Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, Temple of Elemental Evil, and so on. They needed greater enemy variety, because the vast majority of the enemies in the game are susceptible to the same handful of spells, and if you have even one spellcaster in your party, you can just apply the same spells to all the enemies in the game and get through encounters with ease. Or to make the game more difficult, they could have cut out some of the ridiculously overpowered equipment. Or they could have simply added in more powerful enemies, monsters with greater hit dice. I mean, the max level is 32 anyway, and you're likely to hit level 20 even before you get to the last couple dungeons, so really there's no reason not to add in ridiculously powerful enemies. Especially since the final boss by itself isn't really much of a challenge. I mean, the final boss fight is tough because of the softening up you're very likely to get. I mean, unless you get extremely lucky on all your saving throws on your fight to the final boss, you're going to be pretty weak. But the game kind of screws even this up because they've given you so many potions throughout the game that you should be at full health anyway. The only real thing you'll potentially be missing on your way to the final boss fight are some of your spells, but spells aren't extremely effective against the final boss in any event. And the game also could have just used more enemy variety, just to add some visual variety. It gets tiring looking at the same 10 enemies throughout the entire game. But the biggest reason the game needs more enemy variety is because, as I said, you don't have to apply different tactics to different enemies. You can just apply the same tactic to all the enemies in the game, and you'll get through the game with ease. And it's unfortunate, because you have a very good game here, but it's been really hamstrung by some of these terrible design decisions, especially concerning difficulty. But it is what it is.